You know what though? There's this person at work who really made me realise that going to a prestigious university doesn't automatically mean you're good at your job. They've been in private education their entire life, private school, straight through to university, all on the same track. And they said something like, people always say that going to a state school helps you build up an immunity to all sorts of different people you'll meet later in life. But I went to private school all the way through. And even after entering the working world, I never really met these so-called different people. So I don't see why state school is necessary. And honestly, there are so many things I want to say about that. First of all, the whole idea that going to a state school automatically means you'll meet all sorts of different people already feels a bit patronising. And the logic itself is pretty shaky, isn't it? Because wherever you are, you can always choose not to see people. Different kinds of people already exist in society, whether you acknowledge them or not. State schools aren't some sort of educational theme park where you go to observe strange life forms that have nothing to do with you. The point is, it's not that different people only exist in state schools, they exist everywhere. Even if you never set foot in one, those people are still part of the same society, and so are you. The thing that really bothers me is the way people use the phrase different people, because hidden inside that phrase is already the assumption that those people exist somewhere outside of yourself. Like they're an external group. Saying you need to go to a state school to build immunity basically turns it into training yourself to tolerate people from a different social class. But that's not diversity, that's more like wanting a safe guided tour of class differences. The children in those schools aren't educational resources for someone else's personal development. They're just people living their lives. And honestly, cities like Tokyo are interesting. People imagine them as places where you meet all sorts of different people. But sometimes the opposite happens. Because there are so many people, it's actually easier to find people exactly like yourself and stay inside that bubble forever. You can technically be surrounded by diversity and still never engage with it. You stay in your comfort zone. You stick to your own community. That happens all the time. It's no different from school. A classroom might contain all sorts of people, but naturally you end up speaking to some and not others. Who you interact with is largely determined by your own personality, preferences, and choices. So the idea that simply attending a state school automatically exposes you to diversity feels half imaginary to me. Then there's the other part, when someone says, I went through private education and never really encountered different kinds of people, so clearly there's no need to learn about them. Doesn't that actually prove the opposite? Isn't that basically saying, I was able to live my entire life without noticing them? Or, I noticed them and simply didn't have to engage. You didn't fail to meet them. You lived inside a system designed so that you didn't need to. The real issue isn't personal character, it's that private schools, cram schools, elite universities and major corporations can create a pathway through life where you barely have to interact with huge parts of society at all. That's what social segregation looks like. I suppose it makes sense, really. The prestigious companies people end up at after university are often made up of similarly filtered communities anyway. And let's be honest, being good at your job isn't always what gets people hired. Connections can matter just as much. That's why the idea that entrance exams are really about buying yourself a certain life environment feels surprisingly accurate to me. And honestly, this feels very familiar to anyone who's grown up around entrance exam culture, because what are people actually buying when they pay for private schools and endless tutoring? It's not just education. They're buying an environment, they're buying a community, people with similar family situations, similar expectations, similar levels of parental involvement, a lower risk social environment. And because of that, success often has less to do with actual ability and more to do with fitting into the existing culture. It looks like meritocracy. But a lot of the time, it's really a game of cultural capital and environmental compatibility. Which is why I keep wondering, who exactly is ignoring these different people? Because this isn't about Tokyo being bad or the countryside being better. That's not the point. The point is that in Tokyo, private schools and tutoring have become so normalised that education increasingly functions not as learning, but as a mechanism for social mobility. In some rural areas, educational ambition might mean making the most of what the local school can offer. In Tokyo, educational ambition often means investing money into competitive advantage. And the more that happens, the more parental wealth determines children's opportunities. Shouldn't that be something society tries to correct? And then people say, nobody cares where you went to school anyway. But sometimes I wonder whether that's only possible because the sorting has already happened. Maybe school background never comes up because everyone around you already shares roughly the same one. In genuinely mixed environments, differences in education, class, money, upbringing, and cultural expectations create friction all the time. If those differences never even become visible, maybe you're already living inside a filtered environment. The connections formed through private schools and tutoring often become cultural capital in themselves, and people who don't possess that capital can easily end up isolated. That seems like a problem to me. So no, this isn't about saying private schools are bad, or that state schools are morally superior. The issue is that society creates roots where different groups rarely connect, and education often reinforces those divisions. And the people inside those systems are often the least aware of them, because from their perspective, they've simply worked hard. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely a believer in hard work. I've worked hard myself. But I also know that effort doesn't exist in a vacuum. I've always thought of myself as a hard-working person, but at the same time, it's also possible to say that my ability to work hard was supported by an environment that existed because of inequality, and in one way or another at someone else's expense. I'm not saying effort has no value. What I'm questioning is this. If I hadn't been given an environment where my concentration and curiosity could be recognised and nurtured in socially acceptable ways, can anyone really be certain those same qualities would have been expressed in the same way? If I'd grown up without the environment that allowed my curiosity and concentration to be recognised and encouraged, would I really have ended up in the same place? Can anyone honestly know? When I look back, I realise how many people around me saw potential in me before I saw it myself. They gave me opportunities, they trusted me with responsibilities, and a lot of the time I simply followed the things people invited me into. Or maybe followed isn't even the right word. Sometimes it feels like I was carried there. Small jobs, big jobs, personal experiences, failures, every one of them stayed with me. In the end, I've mostly arrived at the conclusion that you might as well give things a go. If someone believes you can do something, perhaps they're seeing something you haven't noticed yet. Of course, that's different from forcing yourself into things you hate, but still. So much of my life has just been discovering, oh, apparently I can do this too. And then taking another step. Maybe that's not even effort in the heroic sense people talk about. But because some of those things eventually became profitable, society labels it as hard work and success. Whereas from my perspective, I've mostly just been walking towards whichever wall happened to throw the ball back. Sure, effort mattered, but I also deliberately chose forms of effort that aligned with who I already was, things I could sustain, things I enjoyed, things that didn't require me to be on the verge of collapse every day. And honestly, I don't think strong people even exist. Most people labelled as strong are simply people who happen to be highly compatible with the current economic system. They're not stronger, they're just better adapted. A lot of what gets called strength is actually obedience to market values. Maintaining the right image, appeasing power, performing in ways the system rewards. That's not strength, that's compatibility. And one thing humans do constantly is look down on the very people they depend upon. I recently saw posts from people terrified about increases to healthcare costs. People saying, "Are we supposed to die?" And the replies were shocking. "Weak people die, that's life. Who do you think pays for you anyway?" That sort of thing. But isn't that backwards? The so-called strong only get to remain strong because the vulnerable are the ones being sacrificed. The dependency runs both ways. Anyway, if people manage to find a place where they can live comfortably, good for them. I genuinely mean that. I've probably thought about this enough for one day. My brain's tired. Thanks for listening. I'm off to have a shower. Night.